Hello everyone, we are again here with Stanimir Dobrev and we will talk about the Russian economy after 1 year of war because there are some aspects we don't know and there are also quite some differences to our Western economies, and Stanimir will give us a better view onto this.
Yes, and I would like to start a bit first with explaining that there's differences when it comes to Russian employment than to just make sense of a statistic afterwards. So in Russia, you have economically dynamic regions, let's say Tatarstan, Moscow, the area around Moscow, to an extent St. Petersburg and Krasnodar Krai. And then you have regions which are more stagnant, and there you see less labor mobility. And what we've seen is that there's a new statistic that has come out. So usually the way Russia massages data on employment is you get people who do less shifts. Some of the Central Asian Republic migrant workers are let go. More Russians take part of that, but that's usually for the big cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow and the region around Moscow. And then you see people being put on temporary leave, paid leave, but they just get 2/3 of the salary. And all of this has happened during this last year. But at the end of the year, a new statistic emerged, which is the non-paid long-term employed, but long-term leave. So people who are employed, but they're on unpaid leave for a long time. And in regards to Russia, that number is over 5 million people, which is significant because generally the able-bodied labor pool is around 75 million, but Russia has seen a decline in the last 2 years, first from COVID, now from the mobilization and a lot of people just leaving the country to relocate elsewhere. And that means that they're hiding their unemployment figures through this new method. And because of the way regions are, in a lot of areas, you can't move to get employed elsewhere because you're stuck. There is low mobility of labor. And in those places, you can't really find employment for people, whereas in the big cities, you can easily take the slack, which is why, for example, over the last year, there are 13 regions in Russia where real wages have gone up. But for the other 70 regions, the situation is more dire. They've seen maybe around 9 years of their wages declining, real wages, when it comes to inflation.
One question, you said 5 million. What was the figure before?
Before, there was no such figure.
Okay, it was a newly introduced one to, okay.
Yes. This is a very strange figure when it comes to labor statistics. It doesn't make sense. If someone is long-term unpaid leave for the long term, you consider him either he's on a sabbatical, which is very rare in certain places, or he's effectively unemployed. But because there's so little places for employment in those distant regions, you can't find new employment for these people, and they're remaining there hoping that at some point the factory will get, or their place of employment will get subsidies and they'll be paid again. And this is continuing and ongoing, with issues for the budget, which can't actually allocate these funds. Now, like I said, in some places you've seen real incomes catch up. For example, in Tatarstan, which is one of the more dynamic regions, where you've seen a 16.6% increase in wages, but in real wages, that's only 2.1%, because Russia also has a high inflation. And it's high inflation on top of high inflation in 2022 and 2021 before that. But in places like Kaluga, you've seen real incomes decline by 8% over the last year, which is drastic after you've seen continuous decline. And here again, something you need to know that in past years when Eurostat was looking at the data and they said, okay, we're not seeing real wage increases, we're seeing declines. At one point they said, okay, this year we assume that there's a bigger gray economy, so real wages have to increase. Let's add a number to get it to the point where we're seeing an increase. Just massage the data a bit by saying, no, guys, the gray economy is larger than what we established. That's why you're getting paid more, and that's why you're not poor.
One question, do we know which industries and sectors are affected, or don't we have any data on this?
Well, it affects things across the board. But for example, in southern Russia, because of the war, the airports haven't been operating. And even during the tourist season, a large part of the civilian airports weren't operating at all. So there we have a complete close down. We've also had a decrease in flights just because of the aircraft are being worn out and domestic production can't keep up. One way they can do it is they've passed a decree that it's okay for an airplane to bypass the Western limit on maintenance. So you can use a part for longer than it says, which is risky, but this is one way they can keep up a larger part of the fleet. Also, we've seen decline in industries like automobile sales. Office space has declined, the usage of office space. From 2021, there was an empty office space of around 14% of the offered office space. Now it's closer to 35%, which is a drastic increase. We've seen a drop in the average sale price of cell phones by 20%, which is a drastic decrease, which shows that people are limiting what they're buying. Now, on top of that, it doesn't look as bad if you look at just the figures, and you look at that the 1/6 of Russia's population that is the poorest has had real incomes increase. But the problem, of course, is that this part of the population is hit unequally by the inflation because they have a lot more of their spending is on groceries. And there we've seen increases like 40% for the price of sugar over the last year. Now, it's not just that the employment has problems. It's also that people are taking in more credits, and a lot more people have 3 or more credits right now. And additionally, we've seen an increase in the drinking of hard liquor and the decrease of drinking of wine, which Russian experts suggest is a way for people to cope with the constant anxiety that's ongoing. If we go to the banking sector yes?
One question for me, I mean, when I hear this, is like, could it be that Russia switched basically to a war economy in the sense that they just turned down basically a lot of the consumer products or a consumer sector and just focus on like in important industry that are relevant for the war and other stuff? And it would be great if my camera would come back, but no.
Well, the problem is that in 2022, compared to 2021, defense production declined. The military industry production declined in some sectors, but double-digit figures. The only sector in which, in subsector of military production where it increased was in communication and remote control appliances. And there we're not certain if the increase is due to increase in production or just the increase of the parts that are being used through bypassing certain sanctions and restrictions, and also the general increase in prices to the inflation. So if it's the military production being increased, they didn't succeed in military production increase. It's just that the civilian sector also declined.
Could they fake the data on the military production?
Well, I don't think so, because if you watched one of the live meetings of Putin with his ministers, the trade and industry minister was given a proper beating in terms of what Putin said to him, because the military production didn't meet the demands. And extra decrees were being added to force companies to not be able to refuse military orders, and then if they're slacking in the production of military orders and goods, to be put into temporary management by the ministries. So in that regard, I don't think they faked the data. I just think that the data isn't good overall. Because this is headline data that also Russia needs to adjust their own plans and have an assessment of how things are going. Now, what they did afterwards is they started making all of this data classified, which is the thing that if they don't want you to see the data, they'll classify it. It will be hidden. But right now, what was still publicly available showed that actually there's a decrease in production and quality hasn't improved. For example, let's say that nuclear icebreakers were semi-military goods because they have nuclear power. When they were received this year, they still had lots of failings in terms of parts being used, in terms of both ships being shorter than the design by 5 meters, which is bizarre.
Yeah.
So we haven't seen that great buildup of the military industry that would make up for the decline in the civilian sector. And there are certain things in the civilian sector that are declining because, for example, car sales are down by 60% for new cars because it's harder to find new cars and they're more expensive. There are other things like, for example, in the agricultural sector, which saw record production in some aspects, it's still trailing behind because it doesn't have seeds, for example, for sugar beet and potatoes. For potatoes, only 9% of the needs of the growing sector have been met by Russia, this internal domestic production of seeds. So these are things that they import, and because they import them, they're becoming more expensive, and this is being passed down to the consumer because there's no way to make up a seed deficit of 91% in 1 year. Additionally, we've seen that, for example, while the decline in 2022 was minor, in 2023, we think that the decline will be greater because the budget can't keep up. So, for example, with the oil prices being a bit high and sanctions didn't kick in until the end of the year, Russia still managed to somehow finance the 7.3 billion extra spending. I think it's 7.3 or 7.5. 7.3 trillion extra spending in 2022. We're talking rubles. But we're not seeing that happening in 2023. For January, the deficit was 1.76 trillion, which is just for 1 month. When the entire deficit for 2022, the extra spending, not the deficit, but the extra spending that was extraordinary was 7.3 trillion. If they start spending at this rate, and with oil prices averaging below $50 for the main blend Ural, they're not going to make it till the end of the year without cuts. And their other means of raising money are raising expensive domestic debt, which is raised usually at a yield over 10%, which becomes expensive to service. For example, in December, they raised 1.5 trillion rubles in debt to have a cushion, and also using the National Welfare Fund. But when it comes to liquid funds, the National Welfare Fund has only 6 trillion rubles. So this rate of spending, they're going to have to make changes till the end of the year. One thing they can do is weaken the ruble to increase their earnings in ruble from foreign currency that they're getting from selling their raw materials, and maybe start printing a bit more. The other thing is that if they expected also coal to be a savior because of the warm temperature in Europe and in China, coal exports were down. Like the price of coal was down when it comes to exports. The only bright spot, and for a sad reason, is that there's an uptick in steel exports within the Black Sea basin because of the earthquake in Turkey. But one thing that I would point out to people is that they shouldn't expect, for example, a banking collapse, because the Russian banking sector is dominated by state banks. So it's as certain as the ability of Russia to clamp down on protest. That's the level of certainty they have in the banking sector, the implied trust. And even though the profits of banks went down to 200 billion, so they were just 10% of what they were the previous year, and they had to set aside 1.1 trillion extra this year to cover new incurred losses as reserves. They're still stable enough for no one to think that there's going to be something like a run on the banks. Moreover, people cannot usually exchange into other currency freely because of the sort of capital controls that exist in Russia in the weird way they handle foreign currency.
You mentioned that the banking collapse won't happen, but how about the chances that the whole economy breaks down? Because this is usually, this happened in the First World War, and generally it's like most economies collapse at one point during the war, usually on the losing side. So what are the chances that here the economy, the Russian economy, might collapse? Is this just basically a bad thing what's happening now, or is this like, could this be the beginning of the end of the Russian economy?
I don't think there will be such a thorough collapse as we've seen with other countries, because they still have other means of import and export. What is, however, happening is that you have periods when parts of the goods are unavailable. So in certain regions or in the entire country, depending on the supply chain. So you have times when drugs are unavailable. Certain drugs are just unavailable in regions of Russia.
So drugs in the sense of medicine, right?
Medicine, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Not the other business. That's
yeah. I was confused because that was
yes.
Like I don't think this ever happens.
It depends. But yes, in terms of medicine, you have medicine shortages. You have temporary shortages. So basically the machine that if you view the economy as a big process that's always ongoing, you're starting to see slowdowns, you're starting to see shortages. They had initial shortages when the war started, when the entire economy didn't know that, there's going to be a war and certain goods will just cease to be imported. And they had to find alternative means, and those alternative means added extra cost. But now we have a second stage of shortages where these shortages are partially addressed and then they come back and they go, which means the economy is slowing down. But I don't think there would be a general collapse. But due to how little people in Russia, for instance, the bottom 18% of Russians, 18% of Russians are living on less than 10,500 rubles per person. So in the family, if you have a three person family, they're living on 10,500 rubles per person. So that's
per year or per month?
Per month, not per year. We're not there yet. And you have to also look at the minimum wage in Russia starts at 16,242 rubles. So when those declines happen, when those shortages happen, people in that lower bracket get hit a lot worse, and then that might lead to further problems, or governors begging Moscow for money to subsidize these people so that the unrest is pushed off somewhere else. But for now, with how things are going, I don't think the budget will be able to handle that. And that's a big problem.
Now, in terms of the economy, how much of this is likely an effect of the sanctions by the European Union, the United States, and a lot of other Western countries?
Well, in terms of the budget, when it comes to the budget, it's largely entirely based on that, because the hope of Russia was that it could survive on exports of oil and gas. And now that it's forced to export at below 50 for oil, it's being unable to actually finance the rest of the thing. Now, the spending, the other part, is also due to the war. It's not entirely due to sanctions. Some of it is due to sanction busting and circumventing, but a lot of it is due to just the expansion of the war spending. And also because a lot of office space is being is not being used. That shows that, for example, companies that were doing outsourcing in Russia no longer are doing outsourcing in Russia, or they've moved part of their staff, or they just stopped doing business entirely. Now, that is also directly due to the sanctions. And the money that's being used to prop up such businesses or keep those people temporarily employed or supported is again a cost that comes directly directly from the sanctions that have been introduced.
Okay. Anything more to add from your side?
Well, from my side, I would say that maybe last year it was premature, but this year, maybe in a few months, things are going to get dire with how little the budget is taking compared to how much it has to spend. They've started proposing things like once a time emergency tax on profitable companies just to support the war. The laws that they've introduced allow them to basically nationalize any company that's deemed important for the defense sector. And the way the budget is going, I don't think it will be sustainable without drastic cuts or drastic measures by the end of the year.
And how could these measures look like, or what would the effect?
Weakening the ruble, printing more money, raising more domestic debt that future Russians will have to pay because, again, it's expensive to service, additional taxes, and maybe cutting benefits at some point, even though that's a bit ludicrous, but we saw it done in 2014. They cut benefits like free bus travel for certain seniors. They cut benefits on the municipal level where certain services were free in towns and there were discounts.
Okay, thank you very much, Stan. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.